So we just heard two wonderful talks from Bruno and Tamara on the history and sort of the present status of supernovae. So now I'm going to leap into the future, about 10 years, and talk about what we might expect the state of supernovae, and in particular supernova cosmology at that time. So in 2026, we're going to have a wealth of data. We're going to have 3 rather impressive surveys going on. LSST will be about halfway through its decade of surveying. And to remind you, LSST has optical and near-infrared imaging. It will find hundreds of thousands of supernovae. It won't be able to type them all, it won't be able to get redshifts for them all. And it only has photometry to get the redshifts, the identification of the type of objects, and then subtyping within type 1As. And so you're going to want to combine different surveys together. The Euclid satellite will have finished its main survey in 2026. And this comprises near-infrared imaging, so much more to the red than LSST. And it also has a low-resolution spectroscopy, Wisdom spectroscopy. There actually is no supernova survey approved as part of Euclid, but there's the desire to have one, and I'll explain on the next slide exactly what I mean by desire. WFIRST is another satellite that will be launched right around that time, and we'll be starting off its survey. And that will have both red and near-infrared imaging, and will also have integral field spectroscopy and, in fact, spectrophotometry. And supernovae is one of the main science cases for it. So we're going to have this wonderful synergy among these different types of experiments, the different types of data that we'll get. We'll certainly have lots of quantity, and we're also going to have some excellent quality. So before diving into the science, let me explain about Euclid and desire. So there's a supernova working group as part of Euclid, and came up, Alex Kim actually came up with this wonderful abbreviation for it. So the dark energy supernova infrared experiment is our desire. And it's envisioned as an auxiliary 6-month survey that you can add at the end of the Euclid survey. Again, Euclid is looking in the near-infrared in the Y, J, and H bands. In order to match supernova across redshifts in the same reference band, then we need some lower redshift supernovae which can be observed from the ground. For example, from LSST and from other ground-based observatories. And this gives you the sort of redshift distribution envisioned for desire, basically from about 0.7 out to 1.5. And you can see that we're talking about a couple of thousand type 1A supernovae matched on to about 8,000 from the LSST deep drilling field and other low-Z observations in the much more local universe. So this has been written up in great detail, led by Pierre Astier, published in AMA, and goes into great detail also about the systematics and how you would combine these things. So in my talk, I'm going to cover 3 main topics. What science would you do with all these supernovae? Now, if you're talking about tens of thousands of supernovae, what science, in particular, what cosmology would you be able to do with this? And then other issues that one has to deal with in order to get that science out, namely finding the supernova is not sufficient. You also have to be able to follow them up and characterize them, and you have to address their systematics. So I'm going to talk through each of those topics. So supernova cosmology, in the sort of broadest view, what do we expect to do? So if we think of it in terms of the uncertainty of how we can measure distances as a function of redshift, Sol Perlmutter and the WFIRST Science Investigation team that he led put together this plot, which combines the distances that we expect to get from baryonic acoustic oscillations, galaxy clustering experiments, with supernova, including LSST and WFIRST. And so this includes Euclid, it includes WFIRST, it includes the DESI dark energy spectroscopic instrument, and it includes the supernova parts. And we see a nice amount of complementarity that at the low to sort of mid redshifts, the supernovae are really the key distance indicators. You then have this nice overlap area where you can actually test each method, make sure they're giving consistent results. And then at the high redshift area where it's increasingly difficult to observe the supernovae, then the galaxy clustering really comes into its own there. And so what can we do if we actually can attain these sort of percent to sub-percent measures of distances? Of course, you can fit cosmological parameters. You're all very familiar with going ahead and doing that, fitting dark energy equation of state. So I'm not going to discuss that at all. I'm going to talk in much broader terms about how we can test the cosmological framework. And so one thing we can do is we can try to test what the expansion history of the universe is in a very model-independent way. Look for acceleration without parameterizing what's going on. One of the ways to do this that's really been developed in the last couple of years are various machine learning techniques such as Gaussian process regression. So that's what's used here, where you basically let the data points themselves tell you what the best fit are, that's fitted without parameterizing. And so here's a paper on Gaussian process cosmography, mapping out the universe, by Armand Chaffilou and Alex Kim, where we're looking at basically 1 over the Hubble rate versus redshift, and the red band gives the Gaussian process regression based on the Union 2.1 data. So this is what we already have in data, existing data. And then the colored curves give various dark energy models, but we didn't do any model parameterization. And you see you can rule out certain models simply in this model-independent way. So the kink model is where you have a transition between the equation of state, between high and low redshift. Lambda CDM fits beautifully, and then this mirage model is a dark energy model where you fix the distance of the last scattering, so you fit the CME perfectly, but you also have an evolution in the equation of state that gives you that exact distance there. And you can see that that one fits fairly well, but it starts to deviate a little bit. At low redshift, it slides right along the bottom here, so it's not a great fit. And then here we do one more derivative. Again, with Gaussian processes, they're wonderful because derivatives of a Gaussian process or itself a Gaussian process, you have very good error control, whereas taking derivatives of data is a very bad thing to do. And so here we see the acceleration of the universe, Q of Z. Again, we see the lambda CDM works very well. Again, we see the kink model is ruled out. And the mirage model here, it's not doing so well at low redshift. So you have these model-independent approaches, as Tamara mentioned as well. So that's one way that we can use supernova for cosmology, mapping out the expansion history. A second way is combining it with other distance measures, such as baryon and acoustic oscillations from galaxy surveys. One thing you can do is you can cross-correlate them, and in particular you have that overlap area, and that can tell you, if you have some inconsistency found, is something strange going on at low redshift. For example, as was mentioned, maybe we're living in a void, or there's something non-Friedman about the local universe, or is something going on strange at high redshift. Perhaps there's extra relativistic degrees of freedom at redshift of 1,000 that the CMB is not telling us what we know about. And so by using these two together, we can do this sort of a cross-check, which is a very important test of the cosmology framework. So you can either combine together the luminosity distance and the angular distance from the supernovae and from the BAO, or again, you can work directly with the Hubble parameter by using a model-independent machine learning form, such as Gaussian processes, which allows you to do derivatives with reasonable error control. You can also take ratios of baryon acoustic oscillations, combine those with supernovae, and by taking ratios, you actually cancel out the high redshift universe. You cancel out the CMB, you cancel out the sound horizon that goes into the BAO, and so you're getting a purely low redshift measure of the acceleration of the universe. And so again, that's a way of sort of testing your cosmology framework to make sure what you think is happening in the universe is actually happening. Here's an example of doing this by Benjamin Lefebvre and Armand Chaffilou at CASI in Korea. This is a pretty recent paper. So what they did is they combined the radial BAO, which gives you the Hubble parameter at a particular redshift, and they used this Gaussian process. They actually used a different regression technique, a smoothing technique, to get the Hubble parameter over H0 from supernovae. And they compared it at 2 redshifts. So this quantity is H0. And so if you measure H0 in this way from data at any redshift, you better get the same answer because it's H0, it's the value today. And so they used the Bose C-mass galaxies at redshift 0.57 and the Bose low-mass galaxies at redshift 0.32. And if you get the same answer, then you should lie along this diagonal line. And you can see that their points don't quite do it, but within the error bars, they're one sigma close to that. And these colors basically correspond to different models. You can think of it as different values of W if you want. That's not exactly what they are, but close enough. And so you can say, well, to get closest to this diagonal line, you want these sort of darker purple ones. You can also do the analysis another way. That is, you can take your supernova luminosity distances, and you can take a derivative, again, not of the data, you can take it of the Gaussian process or of the smooth data, and then you use the transverse BAO, which gives you an angular diameter distance, and you correct for the 1 plus z factors. And that's also h0. So that's a different h0. Well, it should be the same h0 as this one. And again, you want to line the diagonal line, and here it's sort of the lighter colored ones are working. But if you look, the sort of purple ones, within 1 sigma error bars, these two different ways of getting h0 are pretty equivalent. And so this is with current data. As you move to the future, these sort of model-independent tests will become more and more interesting as a way of figuring out what our universe really is. By the way, the values of h0 that they derive from this are right around 70. A third way that one can use cosmology in general is instead of combining two distance measures, just combine supernova with any other probe. We know that you have wonderful complementarity between that. And in particular, what's I think not as well appreciated is the concordance model that we currently talk about. We have these wonderful swaths in parameter space where CMB goes in one direction, BAO goes in another, and supernova goes in another, and then they all three meet in one point. This is actually a coincidence of lambda CDM, that in other models, supernova are always complementary to the other probes, but BAO and CMB are not necessarily complementary to each other. So here I show a particular model. This is called a linear potential model, or a doomsday model if you want to be more dramatic about it. This was actually the first dark energy model. It was written down by Linder in 1984. And here you see that in this plane of the matter density versus the doomsday line, in the linear potential model, the field rolls down the potential, it rolls to negative values, and the universe collapses. So it's expanding, it's accelerating, turns around and collapses. And so in the future, we have this doomsday event where the university just hits a singularity again. In this model, BAO and CMB aren't at all complementary. They give exactly the same results, but supernovae go off in a different direction. So that's why I think it's always important, even in 10 years from now, when we'll have wonderful galaxy measurements, wonderful CMB measurements, why it's always important to include CMB, include supernovae, because we're not always thinking only about lambda CDM. There's a wide variety of models that can be fit as well. And then the fourth way to test our cosmology framework is testing isotropy itself. So this has already been done in many cases. And we can use the supernova to look at the isotropy of the universe, and also look at the isotropy of dark energy properties. Does the dark energy behave the same? Does it have the same equation of state in that direction as in that direction, for example? And so there have been a number of papers about this. And this is an interesting plot where it breaks it up into redshift shells, and it asks basically what is the dipole of the supernova distribution in each redshift shell. And if they all pointed in the same direction, then you would say, well, we're in an anisotropic universe because everything is pointing the same. But you see they're pretty much scattered all over the place. And then basically the size of the dot tells you how strong the dipole is. And so, yes, at low redshift we have this sort of flow near the CMB dipole, but as we go out to the higher redshifts, it sort of just drifts all over the sphere. And so that tells us we've got a pretty good test of isotropy. And again, this will get better and better as we have these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of supernovae. So this is a fairly model-independent approach, but it's just looking for basically a dipole or some other moment. Here's another approach that Stephen Appleby did in Seoul, Korea. And this basically says, is the equation of state in one direction on the sky the same as the equation of state in another direction on the sky? How much does it deviate? And so what we did is we did a mock Bianchi universe, an anisotropic universe, where the true value is here, isotropy is there, and then we asked, what do we find if we were to use future data? So in particular, I think we used Euclid data in this case, assuming a supernova survey. And what you find is if you do the analysis the way people are doing the analysis now, that is, they calculate the Friedmann distance in that direction, the Friedmann distance in that direction, ask if they're the same to a redshift, then you would get a value here. So it's telling you that it's clearly anisotropic, but you wouldn't get the right answer. And that's because it is an anisotropic universe. You can't use the Friedmann distances. You have to use the actual angular dependent distances. And so if you fit a Bianchi model, then you get this contour which recreates the truth that you put in the beginning. So again, in the future, we'll be able to do these sort of isotropy tests. So this all assumes that we can use the supernovae as distance indicators. Finding the supernovae is not enough. We need more than we're going to get from simply these wide field imaging surveys. We need a spectroscopy to get the redshifts. We need to be able to subtype, to characterize all the lovely little bumps that people have been showing this week in the spectrum and so forth. And so the problem is, people at the telescopes won't give us infinite amounts of time to follow up the supernovae. Tamara knows this very well with the Odsted survey. And so the question is, well, how do we get the most bang for the buck? How do we maximize our leverage given a limited resource? If you have a certain amount of spectroscopy time, how do you choose which supernovae to follow up? And so this is basically a cost-benefit analysis, and one can write a very efficient, computationally fast code to be able to do this. And so the inputs are, well, what do you want to optimize? And so you might choose, for example, the dark energy figure of merit. You can choose something else. You can say, I want to be able to figure out what the matter density is or something else. Here I choose the dark energy figure of merit. What's the cost function? So how much money do I have? How much time do I have? And how does that depend on the type of object that I'm going to look at? And so here I took the spectroscopy time, and I took it to go roughly as 1 plus z to the 6, which is not a bad approximation around z of 1 or so, where you're going to do most of your observations. And then there's the other constraints you put in, such as their systematics. It doesn't do you any good to get all the supernovae at one redshift, because you're going to just be statistics limited at that point, and you're not going to be sure what your systematics are. And so the code takes those as inputs, and then it calculates what is the optimum allocation of time that you should put in. And I'll just very quickly go through how it works. You basically start off with a uniform distribution, just numbers of supernovae the same in all redshift, and then you ask, which is the weakest supernovae? Which one do you want to vote off the island or whatever? And so you remove one supernova, and you ask, okay, how much did my figure of merit change, and how much time did I save? And you figure out which one is the weakest in that cost-benefit analysis. So you look at the time derivative, basically, the derivative of the figure of merit, and then you throw that one away, and you reallocate the time that you saved to the other supernova. You just keep iterating through that, and you converge fairly quickly. It's a very nice fast code, and you get an optimal sculpting of the follow-up. So this is not for the supernova, this is actually for a strong lensing problem that I ran. And what you tend to find is you tend to find peaks. You like to have a peak at low redshift. You like to have a peak at some higher redshift. Again, this is for strong lensing, so don't pay attention to the actual redshift. But then as you increase the systematics, it starts to smooth out this distribution a bit more. And so you want to put in as good inputs as you can for what your estimate of systematics are, what your cost function is, and so forth, and then you can scope the follow-up in this way. Next thing I want to talk about is some of the systematics of supernovae. So there's a huge amount of literature on this. And in particular, I'm going to focus a bit on population drift and why it's so important to have this subtyping information of the different types of 1As. So here's a sort of model-dependent approach to it. And so this assumes that there are many subpopulations of 1As, and the population drifts with redshift. We want to figure out basically how much of each population there is in some redshift, but we more or less know what the functional form is. So it's a model-independent approach. If you could recognize all the subsets, if you had enough data to subtype them, then you just add parameters for each subset, and you include that in your fit. So you basically the fraction of each. So that lowers your figure of merit because you have a larger parameter space to fit now. But it doesn't lower it very much. So if you recognize the subsets, it lowers it from this point here down to these blue lines. But if you don't have the data to recognize your subsets, then depending on how much the populations actually drift in magnitude, then you lie in this band here, and this range reflects sort of a range of functional forms, how steep your redshift dependence is. And so this tells you really want to put the the effort into recognizing subsets if at all possible. This is something very similar, except instead of a functional form, take a model-independent approach. We just expand the populations in a series of Chebyshev polynomials, any orthogonal polynomials will do. And then you have some information, for example, your observations, your spectroscopy may not be perfect, and so you have some level of prior on these coefficients, and how does that degrade as your prior knowledge goes away. The other thing that you can do is you can just ask, well, what's the worst possible case? Suppose I want to design my survey to remove the worst possible case, as opposed to remove, some model that I have. And so you have to figure out, well, what's the worst possible systematic that I have? And so what you can do is you can allow a completely free form to your supernova evolution, population drift, whatever, that at each redshift you allow each redshift bin to float freely. And you ask, well, what form of those ups and downs give me the worst bias on my cosmology? We know if they're completely correlated, then that's fine for cosmology. You mess up what the absolute magnitude is, you mess up what the Hubble constant is, but it doesn't affect your cosmology. So if you just bias everything uniformly, that's fine. So it turns out that the worst thing, so this is actually within 90% of the worst thing. The worst thing is if you have a jump at low redshift, and you have a jump around redshift 1. So this is sometimes called the sunset step. That if you have, between the local supernova and your wide field surveys, if you have an offset in your magnitudes, calibrations, K corrections, whatever, then that's a very bad thing to have. And so this analysis agrees with that. And the other thing is it's very bad to have it around redshift 1, which is where ground-based surveys tend to transform over to space-based surveys. And so this tells us we want to design our surveys to be especially careful in those regions. We want good overlap regions. We want to be very careful. And then what does that actually do if you have these 90% worst ones? Then it biases W0, WA all the way to the corner of your confidence contour. A couple of slides from Sol Perlmutter. So how do we do this subtyping? So they're already doing it through the nearby supernova factory observations. And they came up with this. Yes. If you have spectrophotometry, so here's an example of 12 supernovae. Each panel has 2 supernovae. These are the spectra. And there's actually 2 curves in each of these, a black curve and a colored curve. And you can see they're virtually identical. They're what's called twins. And so this is work from a former graduate student at Berkeley, Hana Fakori. And that if you parameterize your supernova with the twinness factor, then you can reduce their dispersion in magnitudes down to about 0.08. And so as we have this spectroscopic information, we'll be able to use these to get an even better distance indicator. Of course, there are things that we haven't thought about yet. In the next 10 years, we're going to have new technologies. We'll have new ideas of how to use that. And I just very briefly want to talk about one. So one of the things that I instituted at Berkeley is every 6 months or so at tea time, we have what I call a crazy ideas day. Anyone can just stand up, say any sort of crazy idea, and people take it seriously and talk about it. And so I talked about cosmic redshift drift, which I really think is a crazy idea. The idea is you can measure acceleration directly by staring at an object long enough, its redshift will change because the expansion rate of the universe changes. Nominally, you have to stare at it for a Hubble time, which is not practical. So anyway, I threw that out as a crazy idea and said, okay, does anyone have a crazy idea to match it? And there was an instrument builder from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory there who was talking about this new type of spectrograph that is in use called an EDI, an externally dispersed interferometer, which is a Fourier transform spectrograph followed by a conventional spectrograph. And you get sort of 2 measurements of the redshift out of this as you modulate the arm lengths in the interferometer. And this is great because it actually cancels out a whole variety of systematics, such as PSF and things like that. And the leftover systematic is the calibration drift. That is the wavelength you're observing, how do you know if that's the real wavelength? How do you tie that to a terrestrial standard? And at the time, I've been doing a bunch of theoretical work on modified gravity, and I realized that you could actually combine these 2 ideas together in that when you delay, when you change the arms in the interferometer, you basically delay your modulation transfer functions, and you get another copy. And in modified gravity, people are very interested in models with shift symmetries that when something looks the same, when you translate it. And so we worked together, so this instrument builder and this modified gravity theorist were working together, and we realized by using the combination of shift symmetries and sort of parity symmetries, parity flips, we could actually completely cancel the calibration drift. He went out to the telescope, he tried it, and he demonstrated a 350 times reduction in the calibration drift that you get using this technique. He presented it at SPIE this June, it made the cover of one of the journals. And so this is an idea how new technology can really start to get pretty good. So they're actually using it for exoplanet studies. There's a big push from that to get down to very accurate velocity measurements, because they want to find planets through the Doppler wiggles. For cosmic redshift drift, we want to measure the redshift drift, the change in redshift, which is the change in the velocity. And calculations show that you can get down to about 10 to the minus 8 with an 8-hour observation on Kepler. We want to get to 10 to the minus 10 or better, so we're not quite there. But this is an example of a crazy idea that if you push on hard enough, it may stay crazy or it may not. It's a supernova conference, so I want to hear other crazy ideas. You're measuring velocities and changes in velocities. Tamara talked about supernova peculiar velocities. Alex Kim at the Crazy Idea Day said, suppose we actually look at a white dwarf and we measure the gravitational redshift and how it changes over time as it accretes. We can measure the accretion rate onto the white dwarf. So keep these crazy ideas in mind as we go for the next 10 years. We're going to have tons of data. We know the ways that we can use them to do great science, to test the framework of cosmology. We have tools for developing how to follow these up and how to deal with the systematics. We need to keep going. The twinning idea, I think, it has a great amount of promise with sufficiently good data. And again, we want to use our imaginations as well. So I look forward to seeing Mark and Nick and all of you at Supernova 2026.
Questions for Eric?
Thank you. So one thing that I thought, maybe one thing that we could fold in further into your estimation of optimization of follow-up is how bad can the follow-up be to give us the information that we need? How much can be like the greater spectrum, can you do it, how small the telescope? And then I had one more comment about the Gaussian processes, which it's not exactly true that they're model independent, right? Because you have to design the covariance matrix. And it's not obvious to me that to use them in that way, the covariance matrix is obvious, and particularly that it's stationary. And I don't know, I mean, I know that people are looking into doing Gaussian processes with non-stationary covariance matrices to this point.
Right, so whenever we practically do the Gaussian processes, we always run several covariance matrices with several kernels, and we always start from different mean functions, different initial conditions, to make sure we actually converge to the same answer. So that's true.
How reliable are Hawaii supernovae for the entropy test of the universe? I mean, whether they are good enough if we compare to other methods.
Right, so for the isotropy, the selection function of the survey has to be very well known, because that certainly enters into the isotropy, and some of the early work on that didn't take that into account well enough. Otherwise, for the supernova, basically you want to know distance, you want to know what redshift shell they're in, and that's the main reason to use a supernovae as opposed to using something else. But again, these are nearby supernovae that we're mostly dealing with. We're going to have thousands of them. Hopefully we'll be able to measure them pretty well. So I think they're a good tool to try.
Can you say a little bit more about the twinning and how it relates to high redshift? I mean, it's already difficult enough with IFU and low C supernovae with high signal noise. And with an expected signal noise with a spectra from W first, I have a hard time to believe that this will be really effective.
Mm-hmm. Right, so it's definitely something that needs to be tested all along the way. W first is in its formulation phase, it's doing these studies, people are are coming out with what the signal to noise is. And again, this sort of feeds back to the surveys as well. So it's something I view as a hope for the future. I wouldn't say that, right today it looks very good for the nearby supernova factory, Supernovae, but in that twinning, it was basically a low redshift and a high redshift. I'm not sure what the highest one there was. I think about redshift 0.8 in the plots that I showed.
Okay, one quick question, please.
Could you go back to slide 11? So if you optimize video memory for the supernova case, how does it look like?
So it looks fairly similar, except the redshift range, again, it depends on what redshift supernova you want. But basically, you definitely want the low redshift supernovae, and then you want a sort of mid redshift supernova, sort of extra bump there, which I don't remember exactly where it shifts up to, probably around 0.7 or 0.8. And again, depending on the level of systematics, it depends how smooth the bumps become.
Does it count other methods, such as BA or CMB, just supernova only?
Right, I ran it for supernova only, yeah.
Let's thank Eric again and